And before I put this all back together, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through any of the parts that have changed from the original build, and we're going to go through what has been modified for it and the changes that have happened. So let me reposition the camera here and we'll get this all going. To start things off, we'll take a look at the battery box. The changes that we've made here would be that it's actually designed now to sit on its side. So on one side we've got two 1x3 bricks, and we've changed our lock, not by much. We just removed the other side, made it mount flush through the top two holes. Those drop in, locking that switch. It just sits nice and flat. And you'll see when we put this all together, the battery box will now sit on the board and not be interfering with anything else. Next up is the initial drive assembly. And you probably notice right away, we've moved the motor inside. The wire now runs underneath, and that's going to connect to the battery box, which is out of the way and all mounted on the board. No other major changes to this. That motor mounts with the two pins. The only other thing that has changed is previously it was a 3-axle and a 3-axle on this side. This is now a 5.5. There's a small end stop that's inside here, and the black gear here is on the half, and that holds in there nice and solid. It's not going to come out. The other thing you'll probably notice, and we'll get to the reason why in a bit, this gear is now, instead of on this side, has been moved to this side. And that's because it's brought to my attention, I actually had the speed wrong on the conveyor belt, had to change one of the gears, and the way it mounted required that this be moved to this side. So if you're keeping up with these changes, that's it for this part. One other change that we did make was with the initial drive assembly. These top 4 gears were held on with 3-stud axles. And what we ended up doing is we changed them from a 3-stud axle to a 3-stud axle with end stop. And the reason why we did that, or with stud on the end, and the reason why we did that was that these gears sometimes would work their way away just because of the play in the axle. It would allow it to happen. With the end stop, it does not happen anymore. So this is way more solid. One small change, but makes a world of difference. Next up, we've got the load turner. This was a beautiful piece right from the beginning. The only change that was made, half bushing was added here, just because this gear, sometimes under stress, would slide its way off. So that locks that into place. It's the only change there. Next up, we got the load wheel turner. And yes, still spins, no major changes to it. Someone had asked if we could use the other type of turntable, and yes, they've proven that that can be done. They actually came up with the way of mounting it, quite ingenious. Unfortunately, I don't recall exactly who it was, but it is possible. So if that's the only turntable you have, be creative. It'll work. There's our load turner. Next, we've got the load shifter. Now, all of these have been pulled off the board because we're going to be setting this up. Now, the major changes we've got here, nothing up in the top part. It's in the shift part. So this is the front back. What I've done is I've shortened this from an 11 down to a 9-stud beam, and we've removed the second vertical beam here. And the reason why is it was actually forcing this to stay flat, whereas it needs to swing and actually rise and lower just a little bit. Another thing that had come up was that this sometimes binds when it moves, and this was part of the original build, but something I may not have stressed quite enough in that build. These 1x1 bricks in here, you have to make sure that they're turned ever so slightly, just to make sure that this stays tight in here. Not too tight, but so that when it moves side to side, this doesn't move and it doesn't bind. And that's the load shifter. Some of you remember this guy as Bob. Now, there's been a few small changes here. This is the mechanism that removes the empty buckets from the load shifter and puts them back onto the load wheel. I was running this machine actually today at a show, and this became an issue. So there was a 3-axle in here from the cam and the gear, and there was no plate or no wall here. That was actually giving it a bit of a torque, and it was one of the builders online who've built this project now suggested this. So we built a second wall to support it. We've changed that 3-axle to a 4-axle, gives it more support as it's running. Makes it a little bit trickier for setting up the timing, but not impossible. You can make that change and that will be very helpful. The other side of this is setting up the timing between the two gears in here. And this is just a change I just did recently. Above these 1x6 bricks, there was a 1x6 plate. Take those two 1x6 plates out and replace it with three 2x3 plates on the bottom, which will lock these two together. So once you set the timing for this, no big deal. And the proper way to set the timing is that when they're both vertical. So this guy and this guy, if they're both vertical, it's actually off by a tiny bit, which I will adjust shortly. As long as they're both vertical, that will make your timing work out well. There's a little bit of leeway by making adjustments in the bushings on this end. When we get the rest of this set up on the board, you'll see how that all works out. We've got the deck for the load shifter. There's no changes here. That one's all pretty straightforward. And as part of this, the load dumper. Now you'll see it's split here. And this is because this is, in the instructions, how it goes together. First is the bottom without this 1x6 plate. I've added this 1x6 plate because I've removed from the bottom of this a 2x6, or sorry, not plate, brick. I've removed a 2x6 brick and I've rebuilt it with the 1x6, 1x3, this 1x2 Technic brick with 2 holes, and a 1x1 brick. And the reason why is for the bucket unloader, the axle now comes all the, there's an axle that comes all the way across and into here, and this brick will keep it from fishing through further. Helps make that unloader a little more stable, as it was also working its gear loose. So let's get this just piled on here gently, just like that. Other than that, no changes to the rest of the structure here. Let's move this on out of the way. You got the ball exit ramp. Small change here, just added a 1x4 brick, and that's with the conveyor on top. We'll rest on that. No other changes here. All pretty straightforward. There is also the conveyor system. And here there are several changes. So let's go through them real quick. This is the part that now mounts over into the ball dumper. So this used to be a it used to be a 4-axle with an end stop that was mounted in behind on this beam. I've removed that and replaced it with a 6-axle. So this sticks into that beam 1 stud deep. There's a bushing on the end just to make sure it doesn't shimmy or work its way off. And then this sticks into that 1x2 Technic brick in the ball dumper that we added, exactly 1 stud deep. And that gives it a lot more strength when it's doing that. The upper gear here, I actually changed this from, it was a 3-stud axle. I changed it to a 4-stud with end stop. The end stop holds it solid, and we've added right here a 1x2 Technic brick with 2 holes. That axle now sticks into there, gives it a lot more strength and stability. Now this stuff obviously isn't mounted on the board, so it just sits all funny like that. Now, moving on to this side. This is where I made the change. This system, it now uses the proper 21 buckets, just like the Akiyuki original. And the change that I made was, instead of a 12-tooth thick gear in here, it's black, it was on the inside in there, I've now changed it to this larger, I believe it's 20-tooth gear, so it runs this conveyor slightly slower than this one. The other thing you'll notice is this is no longer a 32-stud axle, and that's because the length from here all the way to the initial drive mechanism is 32.5. 32.5 plus 3, 35.5. So what ended up happening was we got that 5.5 that we already saw in the initial drive assembly. We've got a 12, another 12, and this one here is a 9-stud axle, and that gives us the proper length to do this without having it to be worked in and out about a 1/2 stud. Other than that, no other changes here. So get this ready to go back onto the board. The ball lifter, no change. This guy worked beautifully. The ball loader, no major changes here. This guy all worked quite nicely. Let's see. One thing I did manage to do, I managed to get the white Lego belt. I think when I originally built this, I did not have the white Lego belts. And I can tell you right now, works beautifully. And that just mounts right in there around the 3 axles. Other than that, no changes to this section, as that worked wonderfully. No real changes to the spiral lift, other than some of the matching colors. The other thing that came up was that the angle of the spiral wasn't quite even. So just some minor changes to the altitude of where it connects on the sides. The other thing though that I still need to improve, something that may come later, is this is the front of the machine and this is the back. The front, if you've got balls coming in from another GBC, they hit this. So I gotta find a better way to have this come in where they can get underneath this, not jam up, so that it can use both sides of the hopper for loading. Otherwise, no real changes to this mechanism. Still a couple of bricks I still need to get the right color for. One user was asking if it's possible to use the reinforced gear here. Unfortunately, the reinforced gear doesn't sit nicely in here. It ends up jamming up. There was a desire to maybe use a bushing of some sort to raise it. The clearance is so tight. So at this point, I'm still using a non-reinforced 8-tooth gear at the bottom. Everything else is working beautifully. And lastly, we have our return conveyor. No real changes here, just a matter of making it so it lines up nicely and doesn't catch on the hoppers as it dumps. Also so that the back doesn't rub. Just make sure that that is set exactly right. And of course, last but not least, our 2 hoppers. You can tell the back hopper because it's got a couple of slopes here. Also built up the side just a little bit so that the balls don't end up jumping out of the edge, as that happened previously. And for the front hopper, just remember you've got this one, it looks like a cutaway. It's just that corner piece, 2 by 2, missing essentially 1 brick. And that's all of our pieces. Let's get to building our machine.